This episode is sponsored by Sentry.io. Recently, I came across a great tool for tracking and monitoring problems in my apps. Then I asked them if they wanted to sponsor the show and allow me to share my experience with you. Sentry provides a terrific interface for keeping track of what's going on with my app. It also tracks releases so I can tell if what I deployed makes things better or worse. They give full stack traces and as much information as possible about the situation when the error occurred to help you track down the errors. Plus, one thing I love, you can customize the context provided by Sentry. So, if you're looking for specific information about the request, you can provide it. It automatically scrubs passwords and secure information, and you can customize the scrubbing as well. Finally, it has a user feedback system built in that you can use to get information from your users. Oh, and I also love that they support open source to the point where they actually open sourced Sentry if you want to self-host it. Use the code DevChat at Sentry.io to get 2 months free on Sentry's small plan. That's code DevChat at Sentry.io. Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Ruby Rogues podcast. This week on our panel, we have Dave Kimura.
Hey, everyone.
David Richards.
Hello.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv. And this week, we have a special guest, and that's Julia Evans.
Hello.
Hi. Now, you did some awesome work on Rbspy. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But before we do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. I'm a software developer. I work at Stripe on building infrastructure and networking. And on the side, I write a blog. And I write zines. And I write profilers, apparently.
Uh-huh.
I do a lot. I don't know.
Awesome. Yeah, and you've been on the show before. I don't remember exactly what episode number, but we'll put that in the show notes. So
yeah, a year or two ago.
Yep. In the meantime, do you want to just kind of give us the elevator pitch for Rbspy, what it is and how it works?
Yeah. So where it comes from is I got mad that, so let's say you have a Ruby program and it's using all of your CPU and you don't know why.
That never happens.
That would never happen. And so you have a variety of ways to figure it out, right? You could guess using your gigantic brain. Or you could sort of like install a profiler and restart it and try to reproduce the issue. And I thought that this was kind of upsetting because I have this attitude where I feel really entitled to know what my computer is doing at all times. Like I feel like I have a sort of a right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I was like, well, if my Ruby program is using a lot of CPU, I should be able to know why, right? Like I have root. Why can't I just know? And so I wrote Rbspy to answer that question, right? To say like for any running Ruby program, I want to be able to know why it's using the CPU right now.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it's hard, especially in production when it takes off on your server. It's like, well, it runs okay on my machine, at the office, but yeah, then just off it goes in production. And it's like, what is going on here?
Yeah. And this is something that like existed in other programming languages. For example, it exists in Java, right? Like Java has these really great production profiling tools, which you can attach to a running Java program. And so I thought that it was kind of unfair that like Java should have better tools than Ruby. Java still has better tools than Ruby, but I was like, if Java can have this and if C can have this, then Ruby should have this, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So.
Well, and I remember that there were other tools that you could install and it would, at a low level, like capture input and then send it out. But Rbspy doesn't work that way, does it?
Right. So the existing tool is this great tool called StackProf, which is the gem that you can include in your program. And at any point, you can start profiling and basically like capturing data about what your program is doing. And so you just run like stackprof.start and stackprof.stop when you want to stop capturing data. And it works really well. I really recommend it if that's sort of the interface you want, right? The only issue with it is that like if you have to have installed the gem and included it in your program and sort of added some code in your program to use it, which you have to have done in advance, obviously.
Yeah, well, and I know a few people have mentioned that it's affected their performance some.
That's possible.
So how does Rbspy work then?
Right. So Rbspy Rbspy is a separate program, so it's not a gem at all. It's not written in Ruby, even like there's no Ruby code in Rbspy. It's a separate process. And basically what it does is it reads your Ruby process memory from the outside to figure out what it's doing.
Mm-hmm.
Because Ruby is an interpreted language, right? As we all know. And so basically what it does is it looks at like the current state of the Ruby interpreter and it just reads memory like out of like it's sort of like the Ruby interpreter is a C program. So it's like I know that the Ruby interpreter is a C program and I know how the Ruby interpreter works because I don't know, like we can look at the source code, right? And it reads memory out of the Ruby interpreter's memory and figures out what the current stack is of the Ruby program.
So in a real world scenario, when would you use something like this? And what kind of data can you get back from Rbspy to kind of troubleshoot or debug the application or the slow points?
So we can start with what kind of data it gives you. When you run Rbspy, it gives you this sort of top-like output that just shows you the top functions that are running and that are using most of the CPU. And that's something that I think not all profilers will give you, and that makes it a lot easier, right? Because everyone is used to using top to figuring out which programs are using the most CPU, right? On a server. And so Rbspy sort of gives you the same thing, but for your Ruby program. But it can also generate a bunch of other visualizations. It can generate this visualization called a flame graph, which is a little hard to explain in words, but basically it shows you which functions the program is spending the most time in.
Oh, interesting. So does it give you actual method names then? I didn't actually get a chance to run it.
Yeah, it gives you method names. So it tells you like which methods are being used the most. So it'll be like, oh, you're spending 20% of your time in this method, 30% of your time in this method.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I can see that being really helpful on applications that are just doing a massive amount of calculations on a request that aren't really able to be cached in some way or another because the data is always refreshed and there's always optimizations that we can do in our code. So being able to narrow down through the 1,000 methods where your biggest bang for the buck is going to be, that's extremely helpful.
Yeah. One of my biggest goals with Rbspy was to make it easy to use, start giving you like information right away and to generate sort of like really good visualizations by default, because I know that most people don't do profiling on a regular basis, right? And so I think what happens a lot of the time with profiling tools that tell you like why your program is slow is people like there's like this really steep learning curve to learning how to use them, and then people will just won't learn how to use them and they'll just leave their program being slow, right? Because they don't know what to do. I don't know if that's what you've experienced.
Well, I know people that pay for like New Relic and things like that to get some of the performance information that they gather. And again, it's an installed agent in your program. And the thing that's interesting is, they never look at it. They never look at it until somebody really complains. This is really slow. And so it is interesting that way. I'm a little bit curious when it tells you which method is taking a long time. Does it break it down as far as any other method calls you call within it? So, for example, I guess what I'm asking is, does it look at the stack and say, okay, this method is inefficient, but it's because this other method you call inside of it is inefficient?
Yeah, it captures the whole stack.
So then you know where to optimize at what level?
Yeah.
Huh. And so how does it do it if it's running alongside it? I read the web page and it said that it looks at the memory that Ruby is using. But don't you need privileged access to get access to that?
Yeah, so Rbspy needs to run as root.
Okay.
The only case where it doesn't need to run as root is, let's say you have like you're running a test suite or something and you want to know why your test suite is slow. You can run like Rbspy record Ruby like rake test or whatever, and then that doesn't need, like if you're profiling a sub process like that you started with Rbspy, it doesn't need to run as root on Linux.
But even then, I'm imagining that it could store things in memory in any way possible. So how do you actually know what you're looking at? Does Ruby store things in memory in a pretty easy to parse way? Or did you have to do a whole bunch of work to say, oh, this actually means that?
I had to do a lot of work to get it to work. Like different versions of Ruby also don't work the same way. So Rbspy supports Ruby 1.9 through 2.5. And Ruby 1.9 is not the same as Ruby 2.5, right? At all. And more importantly, like they're not the same internally, right? Like I don't really care about the language semantics. I just care about like how. But it turns out that actually the differences weren't that big. I don't know if you're interested in the sort of gnarly details of how Rbspy works internally, but I'm happy
Absolutely.
to talk about it. Okay, great. Let's talk about it. All right. So there's this struct, like, okay, so in the Ruby interpreter, you have these C structs, right? So for example, like there's a struct representing the current thread, which has a pointer to the stack. Basically, what Rbspy does is it figures out like where the memory containing the information about the current thread is. Like it figures out which address it is. And on Linux, something you can do is if you have an address in the memory of another program, you can say, hey, go get me what is at that address in memory. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Like there's like a system call you can use called process VM readv that you can call to access the memory of any other process.
Yeah, but how do you know what size to pull?
Right.
So you get the right struct and, stuff that you can actually parse.
Yeah. How do you know what size? That's exactly the right question. So these structs are defined in Ruby header files, like in the Ruby interpreter. And since you have the source code to the struct, any struct is always going to be the same. Like if you have the source code, you can know exactly what size it's going to be, because every C compiler, like the same architecture, will always compile it the same way. So you can say, like, because I have the source code, I know that this is going to be like, let's say, I don't know, 900 bytes or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. And so I know, like, because I have the struct definition, if I know where it is in memory, I know that I need to read 900 bytes to get the whole. And I can know that, like, when I compile my program. So I actually have, like, all of these struct definitions. I have, like, I would say 20 megabytes of struct definitions in my program that I, like, auto-generated.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
Just so that it knows where to find everything. It's written in Rust. Rbspy is written in Rust, and there's this great Rust library that can convert C struct definitions into Rust struct definitions.
Okay.
Because I don't know C.
I know C, but what you did might be easier.
I think what I did is easier.
So with Rbspy, are you able to attach it to a Rails process, so like a Puma application, to kind of see what's going on in a Rails application? Or is this really more meant for Ruby scripts?
You can attach it to any Ruby process. It doesn't care what kind of Ruby process it is, right? Like from its perspective, it's like you're using the Ruby interpreter. And so as long as it's using the Ruby interpreter, it doesn't matter.
Okay.
So let's say that we're watching the Ruby interpreter. I'm a little curious then to dive in, and I guess what I'm looking at is sometimes my performance issues are Ruby, or some of the calculations I have in there, and sometimes my issues are like the database. And as far as the Ruby interpreter goes, it's just going to be sitting there waiting for I/O until it gets information back from the database. So is that a blind spot that you're going to see in Rbspy, and you're going to have to use some other profiling tool for your database?
That's a great question. So I think what you're getting at is that there are two ways to do profiling for any profiler. You can do sort of profiling like based on when it's using the CPU, right? And you can say, okay, like, so StackProf, when you use StackProf, there are these two modes. You can do CPU or raw, I think is what it calls it. Is that right? No, you can do CPU time or wall time. So wall time is like sample every 2 milliseconds, no matter what. And CPU is only pay attention when it's actually using the CPU. And Rbspy actually doesn't support doing only CPU profiling. Well, anyway, it doesn't. And so if your program is spending time using the database, it actually will pay attention to that, because it just samples on a schedule, and it doesn't really care if your program is using CPU or is using a database. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
But that's a really important general principle to be aware of with all profilers, is the difference between like CPU and like wall clock time. I think wall clock means like there's a clock on the wall and here. Every time it ticks, you take a sample, right? No matter what.
Well, your computer clock has a speed, and that essentially translates to, however long it takes it to run one cycle.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's similar. It's just your operating system is giving your program, in this case Rbspy, some idea of how much time has elapsed between, one moment and the other.
Yeah.
I guess as long as it's relative, that gives me an idea of what I've got to do. Or it's probably pretty obvious. I was looking at some of these icicle graphs you have, and if I had written the code or I understood how the code ran, that would direct me very, very beautifully into the right kind of activity. Like, oh yeah, it's this work I'm doing over here that's really slowing me down.
Yeah. Are you looking at the graphs in the README or in the docs? Or?
I was in the docs just going through how you did that, and that was very intuitive. Because I guess that's been my issue as well, is that changing context into like a profiler is so far from my day-to-day thinking that having something this useful, and this easy to understand, like, oh, I get it. Like that, I was not thinking clearly when I wrote that part of the code or whatever, but it's easier to get into, I guess. It looks easier to get into as I'm looking at it.
Yeah, and I think what you're looking at is there's this page in the docs called Using Flame Graphs, which has a bunch of examples of these graphs, of the graphs that Rbspy generates, and what they mean.
So when you get the output, do you have to run it through something to generate flame graphs, or?
You don't. They're generated by default. So it'll just generate an SVG, and you can just open that SVG in your browser and look at it right away.
Gotcha. Is that the most effective way to look at the data that comes out of Rbspy? Or should you actually try and read the output? Or is that crazy talk?
It'll show you on the docs homepage, there's this GIF, which you can see, which shows you the default output, which is like what it will show you while it's profiling, which just shows you like what percentage of time it spends in each function. And then there are two visualization formats, basically. One of them is a flame graph, and the other one is this call grind output, which you can like use a tool like kcache grind or something to parse. And then there's also the raw output, but the raw output is like a 3 megabyte JSON file, which I would not recommend trying to read like with your eyes. Yeah, the main output is a flame graph, and it's where I would recommend starting.
Gotcha. Why did you opt for a flame graph instead of maybe some of the other visualization formats out there?
It's actually I would say it's the only like visualization format that I know for profiling data. Like, I don't know if you know of another one, but I don't know of any others.
I don't know. I'm not an expert.
It's become, I think, a little bit of a standard for profiling.
Okay.
And then there's, of course, like you've spent like this percentage of time, like the sort of total time and self time in each function, like how much of the time was spent like in this function itself and how much time was spent in this function and maybe like other functions that it called. And it can also, of course, generate that. But I find the flame graph is sort of a richer output, and it's often more useful than just like a list of percentages.
So when you look at the flame graph, then how do you determine what to do next?
So basically, in the flame graph, you'll see every function has sort of a width, and the width is what percentage of the time was spent in that function. So basically, you just look for really wide parts of the flame graph. Like you look for what's big visually, and then you think about whether that's something that you could optimize or not. I don't know if you've ever looked at one, but
I'll admit that I really haven't.
If you go to the docs and using flame graphs, you'll see one, and I give an explanation there of.
Oh, yep. Yeah, I didn't click on that link.
Towards the bottom in the docs, I have an example of Jekyll, and a flame graph of what Jekyll is doing. And you can sort of see like it spends maybe 80% of its time. Jekyll is the static site generator for Ruby, right? Mm-hmm. And it spends maybe 80% of its time in this function called render document, which is, I would say, unsurprising, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't know much about Jekyll, but it makes sense that it spends almost all its time rendering.
Yeah. Yeah, I think for a Rails application, I was just kind of playing this out while you guys were talking. And I think the main problem I would run into is just the information overload or the lack of context to what I'm really looking for. Because you're getting a lot of the, any request in Rails is going to go through so much before it actually hits your part of the code. You have the active support, the action controllers, and all of these other components that just aren't normally visible. Is there any kind of settings that you can do to kind of limit it to not put out any kind of gems? So maybe it would just hide anything that's in the .gems folder? Or is it basically just going to give you the whole shebang and you have to filter through it?
It does give you everything. But I think the way I like to think about it is if you have a really serious performance problem in your application, like, for example, something is taking like 10 seconds when it should be taking 0 seconds or almost 0 seconds, often the answer will really jump out at you, right? Like you'll have this like function where you're spending all your time, and then maybe it will be a bunch of Rails stuff on top, and then you'll get to the bottom and you'll see something which is in your code and you'll be like, oh, that's it, right? And so I guess what I would say is like, if something is really slow, usually it'll be right there.
And when you say it's right there, you're just going to see the name of the method, or
Yeah, you'll just see the name of the method.
does it give you any other information that you can use to say this is probably what's taking so long?
It gives you the line number, which can be helpful.
And then I guess the widest stripe underneath it is probably the thing that's taking up the most time inside of that.
Yeah, that's right.
And so essentially then you can say, okay, this piece right here, yeah, if I can optimize this, I can overall optimize the method.
Yeah.
Huh. Do you have any success stories? People who have used this to great effect?
I do. I have this whole GitHub issue of success stories. Can I read you one?
Go for it.
Really happy. One person has this delightful success story where they say that they have this Rails app that's more than 10 years old, and their test suite was taking like 15 minutes to run in CI. And then they ran Rbspy on it, found out they like improperly configured a gem, and they was spending too much time doing like password encryption in tests. And then they brought their test time to, like down by like 30%.
Oh, wow.
Wow. I can't imagine working on a Rails app that's more than 10 years old. And I certainly couldn't imagine trying to work on it without something like a good profiler. Because so much has changed in how you keep up and how do you actually look. And a lot of the documentation will be harder to find. So that's wow, 30%.
Yeah. What else do I have? Someone else says they've used it to resolve production incidents, like where they had a misbehaving Rails server in production, and then they generated a graph, immediately found the problem, and then saved themselves like hours of downtime because they could just figure out what was wrong using information instead of sort of trying to blindly guess.
Huh. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, that for me has been when it's in production. If it went to production, then my brain doesn't turn off, but it certainly slows down. I get pretty jittery, so I just usually have to take a breath and slow things down to figure out what's going on in production. So I'd imagine I wouldn't try to guess, that much, especially if it's an app that really can't be down. That sounds like another amazing use case to be able to say, all right, well, this is actually what's going on right here, right now. So let's focus on what's happening. And yeah.
So how do people usually get it out onto production servers? Do they just put it in a Docker container if that's how they're deploying, or just download the app?
You can just download. There's a binary on GitHub, which you can download. There's also, there's a binary on GitHub that you can download. I suspect that's what people do, though I don't know for sure. If you're on a Mac and you're developing it on your laptop, you can install it with Homebrew. You can just do brew install Rbspy.
Are you using this at Stripe?
Yeah, a little bit. We have it installed in production, and people use it sometimes to look at what's going on.
That's probably a good indication both ways. If it's if you only it's something you want to have when you need it, and you don't need to have it all the time necessarily. Just a wise use, but you don't want to try to figure that out if it's not ready. Yeah,
I think of it as a tool that I want people to use. Not like sometimes you build an open source tool and you want people to using it all the time, right? And that's not how I think about this tool. Like I want people to use it like when they need it, get the job done, and then not use it again until they need it again.
Yeah.
Well, that makes sense.
I was playing around with Rbspy a bit, and I think on a lot of the scripts or services I write that are not really dependent on a lot of other things like a Rails application is, it's extremely useful to see, especially if you need something that's extremely performant, to find out where your gaps are. For Rails applications, one thing that I found that I really like is it's a Google Chrome extension called Rails Panel. And it gives you in your DevTools a little Rails tab that gives you a lot of insight into the Rails application and specifically around the requests that you're making. So that's one that I've relied on in the past to kind of troubleshoot why is something going really slow. And that and combined with the, I think it's called the Rails Mini Profiler or Rack Mini Profiler.
Yeah.
Those are two tools that I've used quite extensively on Rails applications. So is Rbspy limited to only Ruby processes, or could you technically attach it to something like Python?
Great question. So Rbspy is just for Ruby, but there's a program called PySpy, which someone else wrote, which is just like Rbspy, but for Python.
All right.
So you can use that. You can just do pip install py-spy.
So which one came first? Was it PySpy or Rbspy?
Rbspy came first.
All right.
PySpy is inspired by Rbspy. And the author did a really incredible job. I think that actually its UI might be better than Rbspy's. Like, I think he saw some opportunities for improvement. It's really nice. I really recommend it.
Hi, this is Charles Max Wood, and I've been asked more times than I can count, how do I stay current? There's a lot to this question, and I'm working on a solution. Code badges. That's right. You heard me right. Basically, the idea is that you come and do a code badge, and that gets you an introduction to a topic. Then you can decide if you want to pursue it further. But while working on the badge, you gain enough proficiency to be able to pick it up again if you need. A lot of technology comes through on the bleeding edge, and not all of it sticks, but the principles do. So doing badges on the technologies that will get you ahead will provide you with experience needed to stay competitive. Plus, it offers social proof that you know something about the topic. The project is on Kickstarter right now. You can support it and get on the launch list at codebadge.org.
And there's also a PHP spy that Etsy wrote that will let you spy on PHP programs.
People still use PHP?
Yeah, I mean, of course, right? Like, PHP is really important.
I have a neighbor that is really big into Laravel, and we have conversations all the time that basically is him raving about, well, Laravel just has this awesome feature. Yeah, Rails invented that. Oh, well, it has this other awesome feature. Yeah, that's in Rails too.
But, you know, in PHP's defense, I think that it has come a long way since the version 4 that I was familiar with many years ago. I think they're up to version 7 or maybe 8 now or something. And it sounds like they've done some pretty good work with the language.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like something I'm excited about with these different profilers, like PySpy and Rbspy and PHP Spy, is to, instead of having arguments about which language is better than this other language, just be what cool tools does this language have that we could import into, for example, Ruby or Python, right? Where Rbspy comes from is from looking at, for example, Java's profiling tools, right? And sometimes I hear Ruby profilers make fun of Java, but Java has way better tooling, developer tooling in a lot of ways than Ruby, right? Around figuring out what's happening in production. And so I feel like it's more about what can we learn from other languages and not who's better than who.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting in that respect. And PHP is used far more widely than Ruby is. And so you got interesting things going there. The other thing is your point about Java and the other community that I talk to that also has pretty awesome tooling is .NET.
Right.
They both have large companies behind them that are pushing those ecosystems forward. So with Java, it's Oracle. With .NET, it's Microsoft. And then with JavaScript, you've got a whole bunch of tooling that's emerging, and a lot of that comes out of efforts by Facebook, Google, some of these other larger companies that are pushing JavaScript ecosystems.
Yeah, and Ruby doesn't have that in the same way.
Not the same way.
Yeah, this project was actually funded by an open source fellowship, which is the only reason it exists.
Yeah, do you want to talk about that for a minute? I saw that in the FAQs, and I was going to ask about it, but I kind of wanted to get the technical stuff covered, and I think we've done that.
So the way that this project came to be is I did a prototype in 2016 at some point where I was kind of playing around with it to see if I could get it to work. And I got something which sort of, when you build a prototype and it works on your laptop and you're like, this will literally not work on any other computer. So it was kind of in that state, right? And I put it on GitHub and some people tried it, and unsurprisingly, it did not work on anyone else's computer, really, right? It was very fragile and didn't work that well. And then I saw this ad for an open source fellowship being like, hey, do you want to get paid to work on an open source project for 3 months? And I thought, of course I do. That would be amazing. And so I applied and I said, hey, I built this prototype of this program and I think it could be really great for the Ruby community if I could build it out into, something real that actually works on other people's computers and maybe has cross-platform support and all this stuff. And so this program was by Segment. They're an analytics company. And so I applied because it's good to apply to things, even if you don't think they'll accept you. And then they accepted me. And I took a sabbatical from work. I took 3 months off work and I did the project.
Nice. And Stripe just let you take 3 months off and no big deal?
Yeah, well, I asked my manager 6 months in advance, which I think made a difference.
Right.
Right. I wasn't just like, hello, I'm going away next week, right? But I asked him in June and then I did it. I did the project in January, like the following January.
Gotcha.
Nice.
And I feel like it was a really nice way because like this wasn't like the kind of thing that I could do full time, right? Like it's not like it was big enough to spend 3 months on, but not like that big of a project at the same time. So it was really nice to just like take some time off work, do this project and then go back to work.
Right. So you just got a check from them?
Yeah. Yeah. I just got a check from Segment.
Very cool.
So on the topic of profilers, I think the worst one that I've come across is built by Apple in Xcode. Have you ever tried developing a iOS application and then you run into a problem with performance or something, or your phone locking up? Xcode just does a horrible job at giving you insight as to what the heck is going on.
I've never used it.
You're not missing out. But I would be
I could complain a lot about those tools.
I have done quite a bit of Ruby Motion in the past, and I would be interested to see how that could work with Rbspy. Because, I mean, performance on an iOS device, typically it's going to run decent, but, I mean, there's always situations where, an edge case or whatever, where someone's hitting something that you just did not realize. And I don't think that Ruby Motion really has any kind of profile or utility to really dig in to see what's going on. I think partially that's because it's compiling it down when it's running on the simulator or on the phone. But surely there, would have to be something there.
I don't know how Ruby Motion works.
It's a lot of magic, I think. That's some pretty cool stuff.
And my impression is that iOS is pretty locked down. And so I'm pretty sure something like Rbspy, where you're trying to like read the memory of another process, would not fly on iOS from a security perspective.
Probably not. The other thing is that Ruby Motion statically compiles it to the Objective-C runtime. And so you wouldn't be monitoring an interpreted language in the same way that you do when you're talking about something like a MRI process somewhere.
Right.
But
so it would probably be more appropriate to use like an Objective-C profiler or something.
What's funny about that, though, Chuck, is that when you had the simulator launch, you can actually like command click or alt click on a element to bring that element into your command line and interact with it while it's still running in the simulator using Ruby code. So there is a little bit of Ruby going on in the background here while it's running on the iOS device, or at least some kind of bridge that you're able to talk back and forth.
Huh. I don't know.
We'll have to get Amir on here to talk about that.
Yeah, we're talking to him next month, so we'll ask him, why doesn't Rbspy work with your stuff, dude? I'm curious about having it work with something like Rubinius or some of the other interpreters out there. I know that Java has a bunch of tooling and you can kind of get lower level stuff when you're running against the JVM for JRuby.
Mm-hmm.
But Rubinius is kind of an interesting animal. Would it take a lot of work to make it work with Rubinius?
What's Rubinius?
So Rubinius is another Ruby interpreter.
Mm-hmm.
There are also a few others out there like Truffle Ruby. But yeah.
Oh, interesting. It should be possible. Yeah, I don't see why not. I mean, you would need to, like, all of the core parts of Rbspy that, like, look into the Ruby interpreter and look at which structs it's using would obviously need to be different, right?
Right.
They would work the same. Like, the basic structure would be the same. I think if someone wanted to do it, I mean, I would accept pull requests to do that. Someone contributed Windows support recently. which was amazing. So it should be totally possible.
Yeah, it makes sense. I don't know if they use the same structs or not.
I'm sure they don't.
Okay. I haven't looked at the internals of Ruby interpreters to know whether or not, or how much they have in common. So, yeah. Speaking of which, we should probably get somebody from that project on as well. We haven't talked to them in a while either.
Learning about the internals of that sounds really interesting.
Yep. So what are you working on adding to Rbspy now?
Not much. The main thing that needs to happen at some point is I need to try to figure out how to get Ruby 2.6 support, because that's going to come out.
Mm-hmm.
Almost all of the development on Rbspy recently has been by other contributors, which has actually been amazing, right? Like somebody last month, like I just mentioned, contributed Windows support, which I thought was delightful. And it's been really fun to see people just come into the project and make major contributions to it.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll pitch a suggestion here. Some kind of built-in web server into Rbspy where you're able to go to your local host on a port to kind of see a real-time log or graph or a summary of the things that are getting hit a lot. So you're not kind of restricted to your console, but you can also see it within a browser.
I think that's a great idea. Yeah, someone else suggested the same thing. Yeah.
Well, and if the flame graph is an SVG, it shouldn't be terribly hard to just embed it.
That's right. Yeah, I think that would work really well. I've been talking with the PySpy maintainer about sort of developing something like that and then having, like, sharing it between both PySpy and Rbspy so that we don't need to build everything twice, right? Which I think would also be really nice, because then when you go to profile your Python program, you use the same tools. Like, your tools look the same as the tools that you're looking at when you profile your Ruby program.
So does the PySpy thing work in the same way? It's written in Rust and they just changed what structures they're looking at? Yeah.
The basic design is exactly the same. Yeah.
Oh, I gotcha. So you could theoretically use this to profile other languages that have an interpreter that's written in C. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Rbspy and PySpy share a bunch of code because they're both in Rust. And you could also, like, you can imagine writing a Perl profiler or something which shares some of the same libraries. I think that'd be really fun.
Although I don't think profiling is the problem in Perl. It's reading your own code that you wrote yesterday. Sorry.
I don't know.
Yeah, let's go straight to the, yeah. I know people who love Perl, so.
Perl is my first programming language. I still sort of love Perl. Only positive feelings about Perl.
Yeah, well, to each their own. I mean, I haven't really tried it, so I feel like I can't knock it. But yeah, I mean, I know people that use all kinds of languages that at first glance anyway, they look kind of crazy. And then you start digging in and almost every language has something to like, is what I'm finding.
Yeah. I mean, Ruby was inspired by Perl, so
yep.
You know, there is that.
Definitely. So if people want to get started with Rbspy, you know, what do you recommend? That they just run it on their machine against some process they're running? Yeah. Just download it and try it out on your Ruby programs and see what you find out. I think it's so fun to, like, get this live view of what your program is doing and just look at it, like, even if you don't have a problem right now. Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, and if you're on a Mac, you can just install it with Homebrew, so it's even easier. Cool. Well, anything else we should dive into, folks, before we go to picks?
I think we're good.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and do some picks then. Is your job search stuck? Maybe you're not getting any interviews with employers. Or maybe you are, but no job offers. Or you may be new and not even know where to start. This is Charles Max Wood, and I'm releasing a new course and ebook on how to find a job as a software developer. The course walks you through the process of finding the types of companies you want to work for, getting their attention, and putting your best foot forward as the candidate they want. I've coached dozens of developers in looking for jobs and have been able to help several people find jobs within 2 weeks to 2 months. So whether you're new to development, can't find a great job that fits what you want, or are looking for remote work from an area without a strong tech community, I can help. Go to getacoderjob.com and sign up today. Dave, do you have some picks for us?
Yeah. So 2 picks. One is woodworking and tool related. It's a bench vise that I recently picked up. Haven't really had much of a need for it yet, but it's always good to have a vise around the house. And the second one is a deep freeze. So I recently, got fed up with our freezer in the kitchen just being overloaded with just junk in the freezer that, it's all food that we're going to eat, but it's just, not organized. So we got to deep freeze, threw it in the garage, and we were able to move a lot of our overstock stuff into there. And it's been a night and day difference in the kitchen.
Is it a stand-up freezer or a chest freezer?
It's a Chester size. It's a tiny one. It costs like $130 from Costco. So been pretty happy with it.
Yeah, we just upgraded ours. It's funny you're talking about it because I literally moved it into the garage yesterday, and I found it. We have a local classifieds website, KSL Classifieds. I'm sure David's used it. But I found a stand-up freezer on there for free. And so we're moving all of our stuff into the stand-up freezer. It's nicer that way because we found that we lose stuff in the bottom of the chest freezer. And so, we cleaned it out, I think, a couple months ago, and we were like, oh, that's a couple of years old, and that's a couple of years old, right? Because it was just at the bottom, and we just didn't see it, so we didn't eat it. So,
yeah. Yeah, with mine, I'm planning on building some wood inserts so we can kind of like pull it out and then kind of, have a traying system. But, that's
a good idea.
Time and effort.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you have time for that kind of thing.
Yeah, I wish.
Yep. Sorry I cut you off. Anything else?
No, that's it.
All right. David, do you have some picks for us?
Yeah, I found, backstory real fast. So I've had a lot of work lately and had a moment where I just was fed up and hit I-15 and ended up in Montana. And there I discovered Edie Lahey. He's a poet and a writer from Butte. He's passed on, but I found his books and oh my goodness, I'm having so much fun with him. And so he wrote a book called Moving On, or that was his last collection of poems. And he wrote a novel called The Thin Air Gang. And so it's just the reason I pick it is this is a guy that just rolls up his sleeves and deals with what's in front of him. And it felt more like programming, and it felt more like real work, like the way it feels to sit down and code. Here's a guy that a lot of people have realized late in his life that he was really brilliant. So I've really enjoyed that. So I've just finished his Moving On book, and I'm getting into The Thin Air Gang. I was just reading that last night and having a great time with this kind of obscure writer that feels good as a coder.
Awesome. That sounds really interesting. I'm a little curious about you getting fed up and driving to Montana. I've been I get a little burned out, and I'm like, I just want to take off.
I'm writing a long form article about that trip. I learned so much, and there's a lot about self-care as coders and in startups that's important to know. So I'll be writing a very it's about 10 pages long right now, and it's getting lots of revisions. So an important trip. It's important to take care of ourselves.
Yep, absolutely. All right, I'm going to step in with a few picks. So lately I've been playing with some technologies that we started shows on earlier this year. And so I'm just going to kind of shout out about that and some of the interesting things that I've been doing with it. One of them is Elixir and Phoenix. People around here probably wouldn't be terribly surprised to hear about Elixir. It comes up, I swear, like every other show, at least mentioned. I've really been kind of digging Phoenix. Though I have spent quite a bit of time banging my head against the wall. How do I do this thing that is so easy in Rails? And it's like, oh, okay, I got to import this library, and then I've got to, set up these aliases. Oh, there we go. Now we're good. But there are definite differences, and there are definite things that I'm really enjoying. I also pulled in Vue.js, and we have a show on Vue. If you're interested in that, go to devchat.tv or go to viewsonvue.com. But yeah, it's been really fun to pull that in. I decided to just build kind of a simple app, something that would take me, a couple hours in Rails. Just set that up within Phoenix just to kind of see how it all comes together. And so it's an app that essentially I can put in a bunch of inputs and then it'll put them into a graph. And one of our sponsors on 3 of the JavaScript shows is Kendo UI. And so I thought, I'll just pull in their graphing stuff and see how it goes. Their graphing stuff has actually been relatively simple to figure out, but getting used to Vue has taken a little bit of, because I'm pretty used to Angular, and Vue is just different enough for me to have to go and approach it and say, okay, how do I get this? And most of it's bootstrapping stuff. So anyway, I've really been enjoying that. And there's a set of articles that basically tells you how to pull Vue into Elixir, because Elixir's asset pipeline isn't written on something like Sprockets. They actually just use Brunch, which is a builder system, sort of like Webpack, that comes with Elixir. And the nice thing about that is that you can swap it out for Webpack if you want. And it's not so tight in that it'll mess you up. But anyway, really been enjoying that. Brunch has been an interesting look into how some of these build systems work as well. So yeah, lots of picks there, I guess. But yeah, overall, that's been fun. And I'm just going to also shout out about, have a side project and go and explore what some of this stuff is about. Julia, do you have some picks for us?
Sure. So one of them is a book I started reading called Growing a Business. I think it's like an old book from the 90s. It's by this guy named Paul Hawken. And it's been really interesting to read because I mostly read about like starting software businesses. And this is about, it's like not about VC funded businesses. It's about like, it's much more down to earth, right? And it's like, keep control of your growth rate. And it just feels like very common sense oriented. And it's like thinking through things carefully and like how to run a business in a controlled way. And it's been really fun to read instead of like hyper growth software stuff. Another, like I draw comics about programming a lot. And people ask me all the time what I use. And so I use this app called Notability on iPad, and it's really great. And it has turned me into an Apple evangelist. Like it and the Apple Pencil have turned me into an Apple evangelist, even though I never owned an Apple product before in my life.
That's funny because you said Notability, and I had the App Store open right behind the Zoom window, and the recommended app that it was showing was Notability for the Mac.
It's a good app. The Apple Pencil is like magic.
Yeah, you need an iPad, Dave.
No, I have one. It's just not charged. It's one of those things where the battery always goes dead on me.
Well, I know how that goes because my 2-year-old, the only way I can get things done when my wife's gone is we got her a little set of headphones. I'll pick that too. We got her a little set of headphones. One of her shows she watches on Disney Junior is Doc McStuffins. And so we got her a little, themed headphones. They're like $10. And I'll put her on that. And then she will watch literally hours of Netflix while I'm done. I'm a terrible parent.
Is that on Netflix now? I have to check. My kids love that show. All 3 of them.
Yeah, a lot of the Disney Junior shows are on there.
Awesome.
And so
thank you, Chuck. You found me a babysitter for this weekend.
Yeah, we also have Sling, and so you can watch it's live TV. It's just streamed over the internet. And one of their chief architects, incidentally, is my next door neighbor. But anyway, so she'll watch it on there too. But we've had some intermittent problems with Sling, and Netflix will just keep playing. She'll bring me the iPad every hour and a half or so, and Daddy, fix it. And it's because are you still watching? But yeah, other than that, I get lots of stuff done. Well, Julia, if people want to see what you're working on these days, I'm assuming you have a blog and Twitter and all that good stuff.
Yeah, I have a blog. It's at jvns.ca, which I've been writing on for like 5 years. And I'm on Twitter at Bork.
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so fun.
Yeah, it was fun to dive in and see what Rbspy is all about.
Cool. Talk to y'all later.
Yep. Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.